First of all, let me thank Abby and the Skirball Museum for setting up this Lunch and Learn. I'm wearing a couple of hats here. First is the Rare Book and Manuscript Librarian at the Klau Library across the way there. I don't need to go into detail for you, this audience, for why that is such a great collection. But second, as co-director of the Hebrew Union College Press, which published this exhibit book, I'm going to make a shameless plug to buy a copy of the book. Indeed, buy multiple copies. Indeed, go to our website, find all the wonderful books we publish, and buy them all. So that is my shameless plug. So let me start. And I will also make a secondary apology. You can take the academic out of academia, but you can't take the academia out of the academic. So there might be a couple of moments when I get a little wonky. So just feel free to have your eyes glaze over, and as soon as the slide changes, we can wake back up. Shameless plug. Okay. So let's see if you can figure this out. What is this, apart from being a map? There are obviously several correct answers. I'm looking for one in particular. Well, this is the line across the middle is the basic Yiddish dialect division between, well, in my word, Litvaks and everybody else. But Litvaks and Galicianer here. But it also is a marvelously wonderful map because it is also exactly the line that distinguishes between whether or not your gefilte fish is sweet or savory. It's exactly the same line, that dialect distinction. So if your minhag is for sweet gefilte fish, I'm terribly sorry. Otherwise, you're on this side of the line. So I make no apologies. I make no apologies on it. So this custom presents a line of demarcation that not only differentiates from other people, but also creates a sense of shared community and experience around shared practice and experience. So this is part of what's at the root of the customary literature that I'm going to be talking about, the Sifrei Minhagim. So when we talk about customs, we're talking about a set of practices parallel to those explicitly sanctioned by Jewish law. So parallel to. Most often they supplement rabbinic law, especially in places where that law is vague or even silent. The problem isn't new, and especially in a legalistic context, the Talmud records incidents that indicate the existence of local custom at variance with one another and tries at times to devise principles to sort it all out and to sort out any conflicts that come up. You may have heard of the principles, for example, of minhag makom, the custom of a place, having the force of law, or minhag mevatel halacha, that the custom annuls the law, in which a custom displaces a statute. I'll say right now that while those principles do exist, they operate in very restricted legal contexts. It's not universal kind of thing. But that said, they speak to a perceived need to be responsive to diversity of local contexts. We don't have to be able to apply the category appropriately in order to understand the significance of the existence of the category in the first place. So, let's take an example. Now here you'll see a map, and I got this sexy little thing here which has a laser pointer, and let's see if I can get it to work. Okay. So here, this is Babylonia, in the exile to Babylonia, and these are the two main centers of learning, Pumbedita and Sura, so that they're, the Gemara relates, in Sura, they would not eat udders at all, even torn and roasted. Now, the point is that there's a concern that since udders potentially contain milk, that eating them might violate the prohibition against consuming milk and meat at the same time. So that's why it's a concern. But in Pumbedita, they would eat udders. Now, Rami Bar Tamrei from Pumbedita arrived in Sura on the eve of Yom Kippur. Since it's a mitzvah to eat and drink then, large quantities of meat were cooked, and everyone brought out their udders from the animals they had slaughtered and threw them away. Rami Bar Tamrei went and gathered the others, roasted them all, and ate them in accordance with his custom. Now that was clearly a very big meal. You might say he was utterly stuffed. I went there, okay. The residents of Sura brought Rami Bar Tamrei before Rav Chisda, who said to him, "Why did you do this?" Rami Bar Tamrei said to Rav Chisda, "I'm from the place of Rav Yehuda, who eats udders, and this is the accepted custom in Pumbedita." Rav Chisda said to him, "And do you not hold by the principle that the sages impose upon a traveler the stringencies of the place that he left, and also the stringencies of the place to which he went? You should have accepted the stringency of Surah and not eaten the others." Rami Bar Tamrei said to Rav Chisda, "That principle applies only to one who remains in the place he's visiting. But I ate the others outside the boundaries of stuff. I ate them over here." Right? So I'm still good, right? Because my custom was, right? So you can see it's clear that the minhag as a category for discussion is a function of geographical diversity and, for Jews, a function of diaspora. Right? These arise in diasporic situations. The issue of a variety of customs arises periodically in individual instances, in texts and in response. And response are really interesting if you can cull through them, because you will sometimes encounter, well, this is what they do in that place, but I was told that we're not supposed to do that. So Rabbi, tell me, what is it that I'm supposed to do? So they adjudicate what the differences are. So there's the storied issue of the practice of kol nidre. Of course, we all do kol nidre. It was considered in Babylonia a minhag shtut, a foolish minhag. And indeed, it was a custom that never took hold in some communities, such as those in the south of France. Those religious communities never had this foolish kol nidre thing that they did. These discussions of variant customs, however, tend to occur singly, individual instances, and discussions about individual. The creation of a genre of books that deal extensively, either in part or wholly, with minhagim, that developed over time. And its most serious realization is effectively a European phenomenon. So, something clearly was going on in the 12th century. Dun, dun, dun. Okay. In the non-Jewish world, just as a background, there were similar or analogous kinds of texts. For example, there were books of customs pertaining to individual institutions in Christian Europe, as well as categories of Roman law that dealt with customary usages. In the Islamic world, for example, in which Iberian Jews, and where a lot of this practice comes out of, were enmeshed in this period, there were collections of hadith, that is, the deeds, so the customs of the prophet that were supposed to be emulated. So the prophet, for example, was said to put his right sandal on before his left, and to take off his left sandal before he took off his right. That's how you should do it, because that's how the prophet did it. Now, these were not as divine law, but as a custom of the prophet. These customs were then collected into collections, and there are tons of these collections, and those collections were subject to intense legal scrutiny, right? So as a category, books of customs, right, it's in the atmosphere, as it were. What's clear is that there is some sort of anthological authority to customary practice. Something happens to the way you think about customs when you start gathering them together as opposed to talking about them singly. Okay. This was a period in the Sephardi world of intense intellectual investment in codifying Jewish law. The production of law codes operates as a form of cultural rigidity, right? Thus you have a law code. However, local diversity and social creativity afford opportunities for a counterpoint to that strict consideration of a legalistic consideration. According to Herman Pollack, even a codifier like Alfasi, the great Alfasi, saw that when the minhag becomes established, it is taken for granted. It then becomes an indigenous part of communal life, and in doing so provides direction or guidance to the community. As the prestigious Sephardi works circulated more widely, they began to butt up against local practice in individual instances, especially in the communities of northern Spain and Provence. Sandwiched between the elite Sephardi world and the scholarly powerhouse, Rashi, of northern France, these communities took part in a continual process of self-reflection on their communal experiences and their awareness of the wider world. So the circulation of students, the movement, students moved everywhere, scholars moved everywhere, merchants moved everywhere, that created the lived experience of diversity of communities, right? And this is the important point. Prior to dramatic later tensions and persecutions, local custom is a form of cultural creativity, right? These usages don't have to be enactments, but rather the innovations of respected learned members of the community that begin to take root. They're a form of pride and local cohesive distinctiveness. And over time, as the consolidation of the Spanish monarchy made Jewish life more tense in Spain, Provençal Jewish scholars wanted to bolster and defend their own traditions. For example, the tradition of the local Purim, enacted as an annual commemoration of some averted crisis, dozens and dozens of which were proclaimed in various European localities well into the modern period. For example, and now I'm moving forward, this scroll contains a hymn that is recited annually by the Jewish community in Padua, in Italy, on the 10th of Elul, because on that day in 1684, during the Austro-Turkish War and the Battle of Buda, now Budapest, Jews were accused of supporting of supporting the Turks. In Padua, which is located in the Veneto, which was then part of Austria, of the Austrian Empire, a mob planned to attack the ghetto. The municipal authorities intervened to save the Jews, and in honor of that, the Jewish community instituted a local annual Purim, the Purim di Buda, called the Purim di Buda. Modeled on Purim, they even produced a scroll, because what Purim doesn't have a scroll that contains the hymn to be read every year to commemorate that, right? That is their minhag. Moving back, some crises could not be averted. While the expulsion from France in 1306 and with other communal traumas, Minhagim served new functions, crystallizing a sense of tradition and of local memory. After the expulsion of the Jews from France, for example, Aharon HaKohen described how the community needed a guidebook because bewilderment and uncertainty prevailed and it was not always clear what one should do in a given situation. Books fill needs. That's my general principle. And in this instance, a book serves as a distinctive form of repository. It offers order and stability, a kind of rootedness in local practice, and even a rootedness of nostalgia. No matter whatever other functions, what's clear is that the tradition of scholarly collections of local customs moved east into Ashkenaz, where it became a full-fledged intellectual genre. Okay, immediate precursors here. So here we have the Hamanhig by Avraham ben Natan Hayarchi. He's a southern, he lived in the late 12th century. This is the first printed edition from Constantinople in 1519. So he's Hayarchi, he was from the town of Lunel. Now Lune in French is moon, so he's Hayarchi, the Mooney guy. So he himself, as a student, traveled widely, and he records Spanish, Provençal, French, English, German customs that he witnessed, as well as trying to provide reasons for them and possible sources for the customs in the extensive textual sources that he was familiar with. And this was a very, very important and early influential book. It sort of set an early standard of, well, we can talk about other communities and start to try and figure out why we do the things we do and if there's a reason for it. Another is the Sefer HaMinhagot that specifically records the traditions of southern France. So now we're going to talk about Ashkenaz. Okay, now we're moving towards our books. By way of back, what is Ashkenaz? Well, it's a biblical name that came to be applied to the German lands. And it would quickly be defined by that geography, by language, namely Judeo-German or Yiddish, by the bans that Rabbeinu Gershom had around the year 1000, especially on polygamy. Right? That was the first ban on polygamy. And eventually, the collection of minhagim distinctive to those communities. So you can see why a community beginning to get a sense of itself would find the concept of book of minhagim so interesting and valuable. We are this new thing, and we need to know what it is we are actually doing and who we are and why we do that. So for the purposes of the Minhagim, we'll start with Meir ben Baruch of Rothenburg, known as the Maharam of Rothenburg, who lived in the most of the 13th century. He was the dominant intellectual figure of German Jewry in the 13th century. He just like the author of the Manhig, he traveled much in his student years, so he was familiar with a lot of the local customs that he encountered. Extensive volume of responsa that he composed, that he kept copies of, which was very unusual. A real yeke. That touch on all manner of local practice. Right? He was very careful to consider all of that information. Some of his personal liturgical innovations became standard features that we still use in Ashkenazi, in our liturgy. And this is a little bit in the weeds, but I think it's important because it's not only that we have books, but that the books travel. It's not only that we have scholars, but the scholars have students. That's how this stuff moved around before printing. His students included Asher ben Yechiel the Rosh and his son Yaakov ben Asher, who was the eminent codifier of Jewish law before the Shulchan Aruch. And we don't have to keep going, but there were other books that basically were books of basically hadith of the Maharam of Rothenburg. Right? His students were so devoted to him that the things that he did were the things that were worthy of emulation and that were worthy of incorporating into your minhag. Okay. One of his students composed the Sha'arei Dura. This was Isaac ben Meir of Durin, also known as the Isur Veheter, things that are forbidden and things that are permitted. So this is an authoritative compilation of laws regarding permitted and forbidden foods. Now, those are very often very local kinds of documents because foods are not universal, right? So very often books of Isur Veheter, books of food that you're permitted or forbidden to eat, are very tied to local practice. This and similar collections are closely related to minhag. Okay, we went over that already. Now this is the first printed edition of a Sha'arei Dura from Venice in 1547. Now you'll notice that these books are being printed not in Germany, even though they're very connected to German customs, and I'll get to that in a minute. One of Maharam's students, the Chaim Paltiel, produced a book of Minhagim called Minhagim that formed the basis of another important book that I'll get to in a minute, but basically formed the basis of the book written by Avraham Klausner, who's known as the father of the Minhag Ashkenaz. And his student was Isaac Tyrnau, who wrote the Sefer Minhagim that we have in this book. So I'm going to get in a little more into the weeds here and talk about this wonderful book, the Wernigerode Miscellany. This is a miscellaneous compilation of liturgical and other works from Germany, from the town of Wernigerode in 1393. We know because it's dated, and it includes a little biblical material in the beginning, some liturgical material, and then 3 more texts. Okay, one is Sefer Mitzvot Katan, a compilation of laws and local practice. An Isur Veheter of Durin that we saw before, and this one, right? So we have an early miscellaneous compilation of a minhag text, of a related text that includes minhag, 2 related texts that include minhagim. So clearly, even in the 14th century, right, we have a desire to create compilations of texts that effectively codify minhag. What is a German minhag? So what I love about this one is you'll notice that, see it says minhag here, but it's got this wonderful medieval, has nothing to do with minhagim. It's just medieval illustration. So you've got the archers and the siege tower and all this wonderful Goyish Narishkeit going on in the, and here you'll see some more on the same page. But I bring this up because over here you'll see that's the scribe Avraham ben Shmuel. Now, on this is a random page in the text here. You'll see in the text itself, it mentions Avraham, just as part of the text. But you've got this guy in a scribe's outfit, right? Because he's got the book and pointing to Avraham. And we know the scribe's name is Avraham. So basically, he's drawn himself and said, look, it's me. I'm here in the text. Look. These little moments of humanity that sort of pop up in these texts. I love it. I mean, I got a goofy grin, you know. I mean, it's great. It's great. In any event. Right, I was going to keep going. So this is Chaim Paltiel's book. And what's interesting about it is here, Basukot, what do you have at the bottom? It's a weird-looking lulav, but it's a guy with a lulav, right? Here, Ba'erev Chanukah, it's an illustrated minhag book. It's not fully illustrated, but even in the 14th century, we have an impetus to put illustrations in our minhag books, right? That there's some kind of desire to create an artistic as well as an instructional book material. So, and of course, we didn't have 8-branch candelabra yet. That hadn't been fixed. So we've got our only 3. I don't know. All right. And this is the Sefer Mitzvot Katan. You'll see here what I call the swirling vortex of rabbits. I don't know why, but I love it. So this is the Sefer Mitzvot Katan that I mentioned before, and here is where begins the Isur V'Heter, right? All in the same miscellany. Okay. Now I mentioned that his Chaim Paltiel student was Avraham Klausner, who wrote Sefer Minhagim. Well, I'll get to that. Okay, sorry, I'll get to that in a minute. This book is this book here, little guy. Okay, this is Birchot Maharam. So remember we talked about the Maharam before, the hadith-worthy Jewish rabbi, Mr. Ashkenaz. This was a collection of the blessings that he said, right? So this was printed in 1558. So in 1558, the Cardinal of Trent granted a privilege for Hebrew printing in Riva di Trento, which is now Riva del Garda, to a man named Yosef Ottolenghi, who was a German rabbi living about 80 miles to the north in Cremona. Ottolenghi's local printer was Yaakov Markaria, who was a doctor and local dayan, who operated that press from 1558 until his death in 1562, when it went defunct. So for 4 years, this little press in Riva di Trento was operational, and it produced about 34 or 35 books. It's a lot of books to produce in 4 years, including works of halacha, as well as Mishnah and Bible. And you'll note on the title page, please still work. Yes. You notice on the title page, it says, recognizes Christophe Madruce, or Christophe Madruce, or Cristoforo Madruzo, the Cardinal of Trent, indicating the rare patronage of a cardinal for a Hebrew press. What's interesting, and that right? This is so in order for the reader to find out what the minhag is and what he is supposed to do every day. That's the goal of the book. Another book produced in Riva di Trento the same year is the Minhagim. Oh, don't do that. All right. Is the Minhagim of Avraham Klausner, whom I mentioned before, the student of Chaim Paltiel that I saw before. And I'll just show, this is a little book, right? I'll just show you how wild a book this is. The text is here. This is wild stuff. I mean, it's for a printer in 1558. I mean, this is just, he must have had a hoot trying to set up all this stuff. What's interesting is that these two books, and here in our copy in the library, they're bound together in a single copy, indicating a close relationship in the eyes of the former owner, is that while printed in fine quality in northern Italy, they are intimately bound up with specifically German custom and practice. Perhaps this shows the interest of Joseph Odolengo, a German rabbi, or the clear interest of a local Ashkenazi market in works specifically concerning the Ashkenazi minhag. So we know for a long time that there has been an Ashkenazi Jewish population in northern Italy. And they are clearly, right, these are some of the first works off the press. They're clearly interested in works that are specifically related to Ashkenazi minhag. What are we supposed to do, right? So almost as soon as you create an Ashkenazi minhag, you have an Ashkenazi diaspora that wants to maintain its Ashkenazi identity and to know how to do it. Again, small format. I mentioned that a couple times because your minhag goes with you. That's a book, and you're not going to the big honking Bible or Mishnah. The minhag is the one that goes with you. It was meant as a pocketbook to tell you what to do. What am I supposed to do? I don't want to go. How am I doing on time? A few more. Okay, I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit. I'm not going to do that bit. We talk about the Maharil, again published in Sabionetta in Italy. Okay, now we're into Tyrnau. I'm going to talk about the. No, I don't want to talk about Shulchan Aruch. Okay, all right. Well, I should say the Shulchan Aruch. So just real quickly, the Shulchan Aruch is the standard, almost universal code of Jewish law, which was a Sephardi, based on the Sephardi minhag. And it was Isserlis, who was a student of I think, the Maharam, who wrote a commentary, which is known now as the Mapah, that gives us the Ashkenazi minhag for the Shulchan Aruch, because the Shulchan Aruch is the set table and the Mapah is the tablecloth. So you can't have a table without a tablecloth, so you got to have the Ashkenazi minhag. In any event, but I'm going to return to Avram Klausner's student, Isaac Tyrnau. He would produce the especially influential Sefer Minhagim, and that is the basis of the exhibit we have going on. Originally published in 1566, this is an early imprint, right, you see there, is a very early imprint, a very rare early imprint from Krakow. So we have, and another thing that you get from a book like this is it's clearly been exceedingly well used. It's missing lots of pages, it's funky, it's stained, it's got notes all over the place. These were books that were used. This book was intended to set down a common practice for Ashkenaz, not just individual communities, but for Ashkenaz, right? Especially after the devastations of the plague had left many communities bereft of regular access to scholars. So we don't have people to tell us what the minhag is anymore, so we have to have a book to consult in those cases where we can't run to a rabbi or run to a scholar to tell us what's what. He organized the book around the annual cycle of prayers and festivals, which is also, that organization would be immediately popular because, among other things, it made for ease of reference. This was the book that would truly enter the Ashkenazi bloodstream through the Yiddish translation of Shimon Levi ben Yehuda Ginsburg, and would go through dozens and dozens and dozens of editions throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. The first Yiddish version was from 1590, and it was so popular that copies were hard to come by, and a new edition had to be printed, and that's the one that was had woodcut pictures in it for the first time. Now, we don't have a copy of that book in the library, regrettably. But we do have, by an interesting byway, many of those original woodcuts were copied for the 1663 edition of Philologus Hebreo Mixtus, by a work of philology and cultural history by a Dutch Calvinist theologian and Orientalist Johannes Loiston, who was famous for publishing the first Bible that had verse numbers in them, among his other achievements. But so what's going on here is that in order to understand Jesus, you had to understand Judaism. And in order to understand Judaism, you had to look at what Jews did. So this was clearly a popular enough book that even Christian printers are starting to copy and use the imagery for their books. And you'll see these are exactly the images that we find in the Sefer Minhag that we have, that Mark Podwall made his editions of. Here you have matzah baking. There's your making the sukkah. And you will notice, like everyone who's ever built a sukkah, you are always going to be very grumpy to have to go through all that. These are other Sukkot and Shavuot images. Purim, of course, with your typical jesterishness. And Shabbos, kindling the Sabbath lamp. Now this, we're going to move forward just a little bit. Okay, now this is the Hamburg 1729 edition of the Yiddish translation. The Yiddish-JIR now offers a clear presentation without any of the extensive rabbinic debates or fussiness, which the other Minhag books usually presented. Just tells you what to do. They offered a chain of tradition in times of stress or danger. They offered lifelines of Jewish practice to distant communities that had limited or no access to a rabbi. They offered a cohesive framework for a code of conduct for fitting behavior. And they offered a social order maintained by the practices of recognized elites. Now here you'll see she is, just like we saw the earlier, that you have a hanging lamp, here she is lighting the candle. Right. Here is Rosh Chodesh. This is Sukkot again. Matzah baking, we saw another matzah baking earlier. This is Hanukkah. Now we have 7 as opposed to 6 branches, or 3 branches as we saw in the Wernigerode one. Now, here you have Brit Milah on the left, right? And he doesn't look so happy. And you've got 2 glasses of wine here because everyone needs a drink at a bris. And here you have wedding, but it's not called chatuna, even though chatuna is typical Yiddish. In all of the Minhagim books, it's called Breileft, is the word for wedding. Now this is from Middle High German Brutlauf, which means wedding. It doesn't exist in modern German. It only exists left in Yiddish, in the Yiddish language, but only as a kind of archaic form of Yiddish. So you find that these documents, even the Yiddish translation, is a kind of archaizing text, a nostalgifying text, right? Because these traditions, as traditions we want for our nostalgia, are age-old, ancient, and forever, right? So we're going to be using a word that has a more ancient or archaic resonance. Now, the last thing, before I get to I conclude, the last thing that I love is, this is Borei Pri Hagafen, right? We all know the prayer for, and this is the guy pouring a cup of wine, okay? But it occurs here. It occurs in Sukkot, it occurs in Rosh Chodesh, it occurs Every time you get a Borei Pri Hagafen, you get an icon, right? Oh, right, even if I'm not sure what's going on here, I instantly know this is where we say Borei Pri. They were using iconic imagery, right? Even in the 18th century text, right? Bing, bing, time to drink your wine. It's wonderful. It's just typographic to let you know what's going on, to anchor you in the moment. All right. Okay, well, that's done. I don't need any more pictures. And again, that book, when we just looked at, it's a little pocket. It's meant to go with it. Okay, so I couldn't leave you without a joke. Okay, now my minhag, a Yiddish joke, is to tell it first in Yiddish, and then I'll give you a translation. So I hope you'll bear with me momentarily for a joke. And I will apologize immediately to any Yekka in the room. It's not meant to be personal. Okay. Mehr nicht wie große deutsche Rapikeure soll nicht sein, hat Sinorsikis. Isemoller Tempel, rufen sie das. Ist rein und hat sich weggesetzt auf der Lady Bank. Wie sitzt so, geht rein eine deutsche Ried und geht zu dem Platz. Will sich der Ried aufheben und lassen sitzen. Macht zu ihm der Deutsch, bleibt sitzen, ich komme noch sagen Hallel. Macht zu ihm der Ried, was heißt Hallel? Rosh Hashanah sagt man doch kein Hallel nicht. Sagt der Deutsch, nu, aber so habe ich gehabt, Toes. Wiedersehen. Okay. No matter how big a German freethinker might be, he's got his day when he goes to pray. Most pray on Yom Kippur, but there are some who pray only on Tisha B'Av or on Sukkot. One Rosh Hashanah, one of our Russian Jews went to a German temple, as they call it. He went in and sat on an empty bench. As he sat there, a German Jew came in and walked over to that spot. When the Russian got up and let him take a seat, the German said, "Stay seated, I only came to say Hallel." The Russian said, "What are you talking about, Hallel? You don't say Hallel on Rosh Hashanah." To which the German replied, "That's so? Well, my mistake." While obviously a lampoon at the there's a clear perceptiveness about what a minhag is and how it operates. In this case, the Russian Jew acts as an intermediary in the German Jew's own synagogue. But the humor of the joke rests on the implication not that the German Jew has no minhag book, but instead it would be rather thin volume. Okay. On that note, thank you very much.